BruCast is back, baby.
This BruCast episode is brought to you by the BruCast Store. Explore a store filled with awesome goodies from hoodies to t-shirts to mugs. We've got you covered. Stay in style with BruCast. Embrace the shock, set the trend. Visit now bru-cast.com/store. Link below. Alright, hi everyone, welcome back to another BruCast episode. If it's your first time watching the show, make sure to like and subscribe. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, please rank the show 5 stars. This will ensure that the podcast is recommended to even more people and allow me to keep doing what I love. BruCast also on Instagram, X, and TikTok, where I upload shorts with the highlights of the show. So follow now, BruCast on Instagram, X, and TikTok. Links on the description below. Our guest today is Dr. Alexander Hutchison. Dr. Alexander Hutchison is a leading expert in fitness and wellness, known for his bold stance on doping in sports, as explored in his book In Defense of Doping. He's based in Dallas, Texas, where he combines his extensive academic background with first-hand athletic experience to challenge conventional views on performance enhancement and advocate for a more nuanced and ethical approach to the topic. All right. How are you doing, Dr. Alexander Hutchison? That's amazing, man. It's amazing background, and I can't wait to talk more about it with you.
Well, I'm great. Thank you for having me, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
All right. So how did you get into this topic? What is your background?
Well, I have a PhD in exercise physiology, and then I did a postdoctoral fellowship in HIV/AIDS immunology.
All right.
And so my area of interest combining those two is how the immune system responds to exercise, either a single bout of exercise or training over months and years. And with that, if you get a PhD in exercise physiology, most of those who that I know have the same degree that I do are also very big sports fans. They may not be quite as much of a sports junkie as I am, but they certainly follow it. And when you follow it, you follow the politics of it, and you follow the history of it, and all the major events that take place, over the course of a single Olympic cycle, et cetera. And during that process of watching sports for many, many years, I've watched the evolution of our thought process about doping and what that means, what type of drugs and or processes have been banned, and the reasons why, according to those who are in charge, which would be the World Anti-Doping Agency, known as WADA, which is run by the International Olympic Committee. So in terms of how did I actually come to this conclusion that we needed to have basically a resetting of the way that we assess what doping is and how to punish it if we're going to punish it, it was a very long process, as is usually for my experience in my life and watching others. When they come to a conclusion of this magnitude, it's not something that you do with a snap of a finger. It takes time to think these things through and come to a rational, reasonable conclusion. And effectively, my rational and reasonable conclusion, as far as my judgment is not necessarily that we need to just open up the floodgates and let everybody dope in every means possible, but that there are a number of drugs that are currently on the banned list that do have reasonable uses for athletes, particularly when they're trying to recover from injury. And then there's a number of other drugs, particularly illicit drugs like marijuana, that should never be on the banned list to begin with, because WADA shouldn't be telling us what we can and can't do in our off time. There are a number of issues when it comes to the sensitivity of the test being maybe too high. They are able to find metabolites of drugs in really minute levels that could also occur and have been shown to occur from tainted food, tainted water, tainted drugs, and even sex. So even sexual intercourse can pass a drug or metabolites of it from one person to another. That has been documented.
No way. Are you kidding me? That's insane. No. Is this somehow related to the fact they have cardboard beds at the Olympic site?
That was one of the stories that I heard about the organization of the Olympics this year that I found just laughable. I know for sure that one of the reasons, because they said so, that they wanted to have the cardboard beds was to reduce the amount of sexual intercourse that was taking place within the Olympic Village. But the first question I would ask anybody who thought that that was a good idea was, have you ever been to college? Have you ever been in a dorm before? Sex can take place between young, attractive, physically fit people from all across the globe who have nothing better to do any place, anytime, under any circumstances. So cardboard beds isn't going to change any of that.
Yeah, this makes a little sense. But let's cover the basics a little bit. So I never practiced any sport professionally, and I never came in contact with anyone who I don't even know what's the correct term, doped. Like, can you say that, or is that the correct term?
Sure.
Or were influenced by it, or had to deal with it? So what is doping exactly? So when you take a substance, let's see if I understand. When you take any type of substance that enhances and improves enhances your abilities and improves your chances of winning, is that correct?
That would be, so that's certainly one way that's one way you can look at it. So you're either going to take in a substance that's going to improve your athletic performance for the purposes of making it so that you have a better chance of winning, or it is a practice or process that you could use. So if you think of another way, the first time that I ever heard the term blood doping was when I was 10 years old. And this was during the 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles. The track cycling team from the United States used a process that was then called blood doping. And since then, it has been a blanket term that we use for anything that's going to be athletic performance enhancement. But in this case, what these athletes did, and it was perfectly legal when they did it, was that they took a blood transfusion from a family member who had the similar blood type, so they were safe as far as that was concerned, to allow them to have more red blood cells right before their event. If you have more red blood cells, you can transport more oxygen to the muscles, and that will delay fatigue and allow you to perform at a higher level. And it is certainly a performance enhancement method, but that's not a drug. So you can see the difference between the two. Now, there are other drugs that you may take in order to flush out any remnants of the drugs that you were taking that were performance enhancing. So let's say you were taking erythropoietin, which is a hormone that will increase your red blood cell count, or you're taking testosterone for the purposes of putting on additional muscle mass. And you know that you're going to get tested in 2 weeks. The one thing you definitely want to do is to metabolize those hormones and get them out of your system as quickly as possible. So some people will take a diuretic because that's going to obviously increase your urine volume and frequency to flush all that stuff out. And if it doesn't flush it out, it dilutes your urine down so much that it makes it difficult to actually find any metabolites that are in it. So the diuretics themselves are not performance enhancing drugs, but they are what we call masking agents. So that gives you a pretty good sense as to what we're talking about when we talk about doping. Anything that you can use to enhance your performance or cover up the fact that you have are considered doping agents.
Okay, so even the drug that you take in order to cover it up or to remove it from your system is considered doping.
Yes.
Wow, that's so interesting, and that's a common practice. Like how
Unfortunately, yes. Now, I mean, there are a number of testers have gotten significantly better at catching all the old school methods. So the classic drug that you're going to see used frequently is going to be testosterone or some derivative thereof, some sort of anabolic steroids. Those are the classic ones because we know for sure that they work to enhance athletic performance. The stronger you are, the faster you're going to run, the faster you're going to swim, the more weight you can lift, and the faster you're going to recover between bouts of exercise, either during a competition or between competitions. So we know that those work. And so those ones are pretty easy to find, and most athletes would avoid using them unless they have some very skilled chemists who are working with them and physiologists who can time out when they would take it so that it doesn't show up on a drug test. That said, if we look back at a scandal that took place in the early 2000s called the BALCO scandal, and BALCO stands for, it's BALCO, and that stands for Bay Area Laboratory Cooperative. And it was run by a person named Victor Conti. And Victor Conti started off by selling supplements. And that's usually the cover for most of these guys who are selling other drugs, is that they sell supplements. In this case, he had a friend of his who was a chemist, and his friend dug through all of the old East German catalogs of different drugs that they had produced for the purposes of enhancing their athletes' performances during the Olympics, particularly in the 1970s and into the 1980s. And after the Berlin Wall fell down, some of these books came out and we were able to find them. This particular chemist found 2 or 3 derivatives of testosterone or some sort of anabolic steroid that he could tweak just a teeny little bit to make it undetectable in the test that they currently had. But it still worked exceedingly well. So there were a number of athletes that took this drug called the Clear. So it was a concoction that you would drop underneath your tongue and swallow it that way. So you had athletes like Marion Jones, Barry Bonds, and there was a couple of other NFL players as well who were all within Victor Conti's stable of athletes who were taking these things. No one would have ever detected that drug, the Clear, had one of his, I guess, colleagues who was disgruntled with him not taken one of the syringes that still had residue of the Clear and sent it in to USADA, the United States Anti-Doping Agency, anonymously. Once they had that, they could reverse engineer what that drug was, and then they could start looking for it. But you can see my point. If you have the appropriate chemist, they can generate a new cocktail of any drug that they want and tweak it just a little bit so that it still works within the body to get the benefits that you want, but it's undetectable to the testers. So the testers will always be 1, 2, 5, 10 steps behind the cheats. That's never going to end. So anyway, that's the part I would say about that.
Okay, so it sounds a lot like a game of cat and mouse.
Very much so.
I see. Wow, man, that's so.
And that's never going to change, largely because of human nature. All of us want to win. All of us want to do everything we can within our powers to win. Whether we're athletes or not doesn't really matter. And I get into this in my book as well. There's tons of examples of everyday humans who have no athletic prowess whatsoever, who take pharmaceutical drugs for the purposes of doing something better. Many of my students, when I was a college professor, would take Ritalin, and they didn't have, or not Ritalin, Adderall, same thing basically. But they would take it so that they could focus better on tests. In many instances, they told me that they would take it so they would have more confidence in when they were in social settings where they would normally be unconfident. All of these students who I polled and asked about this, maybe 5% of them actually had a prescription, but most of them got them from friends who had a prescription themselves and would sell it to them at street market value, which was actually quite a bit. So there's that. We can think of other types of drugs that other people use. And this is my classic example that I put in my book. If you look at symphony musicians, particularly within the United States, there is an organization, a national organization of symphony musicians that's effectively a union. And they frequently will poll their symphony players for a number of different questions. In this case, they were asking them, have you ever taken or considered taking a beta blocker? Now, a beta blocker is a pharmaceutical drug that you take to lower your blood pressure. And it does that by reducing the ability of the heart to beat fast, but also reducing the ability of the heart to beat hard, okay? If you're a symphony musician, you want your hands to be nice and steady. And you don't want your chest pounding while you're trying to play these songs. So the percentage of musicians who answered in the affirmative that they had either considered had in the past taken or were currently taking beta blockers was 73%. So this massive number of individuals taking what is absolutely a performance-enhancing drug, but it doesn't cause any particular scandal anywhere because it's not athletics. So this idea that the doping is only within athletics, and that this is a problem that is specific to athletics is absolutely wrong. We all dope in some form or fashion to increase our libido, to increase our capacity to have sex, to put on additional hair if you're losing your hair. All of these examples we can cite. Ozempic is a classic drug that is a performance-enhancing drug. The idea that you can just take the shot and lose some weight without having to do anything in addition to that's what you're looking for. So this goes across all classes. It goes across all racial groups, all countries. We're going to do the same thing.
I see. So it's tied to human nature.
Absolutely.
I mean, depending on the situation, you always want to enhance something. I can talk for myself. I drink coffee in the morning because I want to.
Sure.
I want to just focus better, wake up faster, and when I'm hanging out with friends, I drink a glass of beer or two because I want to, get this social lubricant going and be able to express myself better. And it works. So I guess every setting encourages a certain type of doping. I think the problem the main problem is when there's money and then like status involved. When we're talking about actual sports, right? I think then it becomes a problem, especially if there's like rules against it. Then I see how tricky it can get.
Sure. But when it comes to this stuff, if we go back to the symphony musicians just for a moment, there's money involved in this too. If you look at how a symphony is arranged, you have your first chair, your second chair, your third chair, all the way down. And each of I had a debate with my dad as to whether there was actually a monetary difference between being first chair versus second chair versus third chair. So I looked it up and I spoke to some of my friends who were musicians, and they told me absolutely there is. Now, each one of these symphonies, especially the major ones, well, actually all of them, they're nonprofit organizations. And so by federal law in the United States, they're required to make their tax return public. And so you can go onto what's called ProPublica, it's a website, and you can look up the tax returns for any one of these symphony organizations, and they have the salaries for each one of the people that's present. And you can see how much more the first chair makes versus the second chair versus the third chair. And they have these competitions annually to see who's going to be re-ranked in which order. And so again, the notion that money doesn't play a role, it absolutely does. But what you're talking about is relative to sport. And in that case, the stakes are significantly higher. Here's why. When I go to see my team, I have a vested emotional interest in how my team plays. I want to see my Houston teams, because that's my hometown, play as best they possibly can. When I go to the Dallas Symphony, I don't have an emotional investment in how well the players play. It's just not the same thing. If they played poorly, I'm not well educated enough in terms of music to be able to detect if they had or not, unless they fell over, on the floor. That's really where we get this distinction. When we saw the people who were initially outraged by the fact that athletes would even do this, they were either outraged at their athlete, who they had an emotional stake in, or their athlete or the athlete who was doping beat their athlete, who they had an emotional stake in. That's where these ideas really come to the fore, is that we have to protect the nature of the sport, is what the sporting organizations will tell you. What I've seen is that over the decades, let's say from 1988, when Ben Johnson beat Carl Lewis in the Seoul Olympics, that was an enormous scandal. Now, when Marion Jones did the same thing in Sydney 2000, it was less of a scandal. And now if you look at modern day athletes, when we see this, we don't think much of it. There were 23 Chinese swimmers who popped positive for some drug, we don't know what it was, in the previous Olympics leading into Tokyo. None of them were punished by the IOC. And they kept it secret until recently. And the only people who were really upset about that were mostly Westerners like us. But if they care so little that they were allowed to just go ahead and compete anyway, because they made up some excuse about contamination, which may have been true, but the fact that they kept it secret for 3 years makes me a little, I'm skeptical as to whether that's the case or not. That emotional stake in what we expect from our athletes has decreased over time, because I think many of us are starting to see, as the idea of doping has become pretty mainstream, what we see within our own environments, like we're talking before, is that all of us are willing to take certain drugs to make us feel better and do better things. And when this started, certainly within our country, I don't know how it is in Germany, but for many, many decades, pharmaceutical companies were prohibited for advertising their drugs. They could not do so at all. And then in the early 2000s, there was that regulation was removed. And so pharmaceutical companies could start to advertise their drugs. And what happened was the pharmaceutical companies made so much more money because now they had patients going to their doctors requesting a specific drug. Okay, so now we see that all of us are very willing to take whatever we need to feel better. Do we really care as much as we used to if somebody gets caught taking a drug to perform better? I don't think we do.
I understand. Okay. So, with all of that said, like my understanding is the problem is not taking the drug, it's taking the drug and not telling anyone. I think that's what seems to be the problem. Am I right?
Well, if you take the drug and tell somebody, you're going to be banned for at least 4 years. So I don't know that it's necessarily keeping it secret. There is no other option. If you're going to take a banned substance, you have to keep it secret or you lose your career. So because of the way the rules are written, and because the objective of the rules is to punish the athlete at the highest level you possibly can, instead of it being for the purposes of education and rehabilitation, there is no incentive whatsoever to come clean as to whether or not you took a drug or not.
Why they just don't make like two categories? One where they allow it, one they don't. Wouldn't that solve everything?
Well, we have something coming down the pike right now called the enhanced games. This is going to debut in 2025 sometime. This is the brainchild of Aaron D'Souza, and it's being backed by Peter Thiel, who is the person who created PayPal. So they are coming up with this idea to have basically a parallel games to the Olympics during which these drugs will be allowed to be taken. Now, they're not making anybody take them. They're not going to test for them, so they don't know if they're going to be taking them or not. Excuse me. But what they are going to do, and this is something that's not currently being done, is that they're going to give them very frequent health screenings to make sure that they're as healthy as they can possibly be. Now, I don't know what's going to happen if one of these athletes fails a health screening, whether they just take them out of the games or there's going to be some other remediation. I don't know, but that is the plan. And there's quite a bit of a push towards this idea. It seems to be a very popular idea, and we'll see how it happens. I don't see the Olympics changing their ways anytime soon in terms of how they do things.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea because people will take whatever they need to in order to enhance their capabilities, right? We just talked that. So some people will take the drugs no matter what. Just create a category for them and let them be happy. This category probably won't be as popular. I don't know. Maybe it will even more, but I doubt. And they can do whatever they want within the limits of the regulations, because I guess I would assume so that one of the reasons why many of those drugs are prohibited is because they are dangerous. Am I right? They can.
That is correct. So when WADA designates a drug or practice to be on the banned list, that drug or practice has to meet one of three criteria. One, it enhances athletic performance. Now, we know for sure that there's several drugs that do, but when new drugs come on, they're not going to be tested in the sense that we're going to have a study to see if they actually enhance athletic performance in athletes, because it would be an unethical study because there's the potential that it could be harmful. So a lot of that is just guessing that it is actually going to have some sort of an enhancing benefit. The second rule is whether or not it could be dangerous to the athlete. So that is really the crux of the matter when it comes to these particular drugs. And then the third one is basically the catch-all. So let's say that there's a new drug that comes on the market, can't really prove that it enhances athletic performance. There's no evidence to suggest that it's dangerous to the athletes. But then the third one is the catch-all, and they say that it's against the spirit of sport to take this. Now, that could be anything. But if WADA designates it as being against the spirit of sport, then it's banned. And that's just the way it is. So, yes, you're absolutely right. There is the potential that these drugs can be harmful. Now, here's my caveat and my retort to that. In many respects, the sports that these people are performing and participating in are significantly more dangerous than any drug that they could possibly take and put in their body to enhance their athletic performance. And I'll give you my favorite example, and that's the Tour de France or any major cycling event. Now, this is all going to be subjective in terms of who determines whether or not they're more or less dangerous than the sport themselves. But cycling is a dangerous sport. If you look at something like the Tour de France, these guys are flying down mountains at between 60 and 80 miles an hour. In many respects, until very recently, these roads that they're going on are extremely narrow. My wife and myself and my daughter, so our family, we were in France 2 years ago for the Tour de France, and we drove along several of these mountains. We drove the Galibier, which is one of the bigger ones. And that road was remarkably narrow. I mean, it was barely enough space for two cars to go side by side past each other. And if it's raining, they're going to go just as fast. Until the early 90s, cyclists weren't even required to wear helmets. So crashes are frequent, and they're expected, and they hurt. And so many athletes will have to drop out of the race if they crash, but many athletes will continue on. And so, the idea that erythropoietin, this hormone that increases red blood cell count, is going to be more dangerous than competing in that particular sport, I think is questionable at best. If we look at another sport like American football, we have now tons of empirical evidence over the last, I guess it'd be about 15, 20 years, that repeated concussive hits to the head, even subconcussive hits to the head, cause this degenerative disease within the brain where we have plaques that develop over time. And so we've done our best to try to, or the NFL has done its best to try to legislate out a lot of the more violent hits that take place, but they still happen. So again, if you're going to ask me, are you more concerned about an athlete being injured by taking testosterone so they can perform better as a football player in America, or the hits that they're going to take? I'm much more concerned about the hits that they're going to take.
I see. And as far as I understand, testosterone is becoming more and more popular nowadays. I hear about
very much.
TRT, testosterone replacement therapy. It was considered dangerous. Nobody knew it. You should take it. You have a heart attack, you die. But nowadays, apparently, when you're around 40, your body doesn't produce that amount of testosterone anymore required in order to have a good mood and maintain some muscle, mass.
Yes.
So it's actually recommended to do TRT. Do you agree with that? Am I right?
I have been on testosterone for close to 15 years now. We're going on 15 years now. Now, I had a specific reason to go on. I had testicular cancer in 98. The one remaining testicle that I had that was functional, when I turned about 35, which is when I got married, that's right around the time that it just stopped working as well as it was supposed to be working. So we were trying to have a kid. I couldn't have testosterone. I couldn't take exogenous testosterone that would knock down my sperm count. So I had to take what's called HCG, which stimulated my remaining testicle to make its own testosterone. But this was not covered by insurance. It was $200, $300 a month, and I had to give myself an injection every other day. And so after that was about a year and a half, and we had one miscarriage along the way. Once my wife finally had a pregnancy that stuck, my doctor said, look, let's get you off the HCG because it's too expensive, and let's put you on the testosterone. And I've never looked back. I can tell you for myself that my workouts got better. My sleep dramatically improved. My mood was better. I didn't feel morose all the time. And overall, everything was just better. Now, in men, there is not nearly as much concern historically with them taking hormone replacement therapy specifically for testosterone. In women, that's not quite the same thing. There was a lot, and there still is some evidence that many of the cancers that women can get are driven by estrogen. So giving a woman additional estrogen after a certain phase of her life was frowned upon because it could potentially turn into things like breast cancer, ovarian cancer, uterine cancer. But the more recent data suggests that you can still do it. You just have to monitor it very closely. My impression of things is that these clinics have popped up all over the place. Taking additional testosterone after the age of 40 is commonplace all over the place, which is another one of the reasons why I think our attitudes towards doping has changed quite dramatically. Because, it used to be when we thought about taking testosterone, that was like, it was a Drago in Rocky IV, right? He was this pumped up evil person. So that was the image in our head, was that this was what the East Germans do and the Soviets, but it was not something that Americans do. Until we started taking it right and left, and now we're like, well, maybe it's pretty good. So those attitudes have changed quite dramatically. You're quite right about that.
Yeah, but to be fair, it can be how to say, it can be abused, right?
Of course,
the goal of TRT is to maintain a healthy level, right? What people do when they dope, as far as I understand, they just abuse the hell out of it, and then they can get like the evil dude from yeah.
It depends on what your objective is. Now, if you're going to take testosterone, you're going to take it for one of two reasons. You're either going to take it to put on muscle mass, and in that instance, you are going to have to take what we call super physiological levels. You will take a level that's much higher than you would naturally have within your body. And under those circumstances, there are definitely drawbacks and there are ramifications to it in terms of your health, for sure. On the other end, if we look at athletes, again, I'm going to go back to cycling. Cyclists during that doping phase, the steroid era of cycling, which was, started right around 1991 and went through probably about 2010. One of the drugs that they would frequently take was testosterone. Now, think of cyclists. They don't look bulked up at all. So they're taking extremely small doses, little micro dosages. Usually they would administer it with a patch on the skin. But then when that became too high and you could be tested for it, then they started to microdose direct intravenous injections underneath or directly into usually their feet so they couldn't get caught. But those small doses were there for the purposes of allowing them to recover between stages of a race, not for the purpose of putting on bulk. So there you're probably not going to have enough of that testosterone going into the system to make it dangerous, but it still can be. But this brings me back to my points. Anything can be abused when it comes to athletics or any other aspect of life. You can abuse any one of these drugs. You can work out entirely too much and be obsessive about that. That can then drive down your immune responses and you can become sick more often. In females, if they work out too much and they eat too little, they'll lose their menstrual cycle, which is called amenorrhea. Many women would think that that's a convenient thing, that they don't have to deal with that anymore, but it drives down their bone mineral density and it makes it so they're going to be osteoporotic in their 20s and 30s. So when we talk about, hey, that could be abused, absolutely it can, but so can every other aspect of anything that we do in our lives. So that by itself, I don't think should be a disqualifier to whether or not we want to pursue the idea of allowing certain drugs to still be taken.
Okay, one of those drugs, as you mentioned earlier, is cannabis, which for me is insane because, as far as I understand, when you smoke weed or get it,
you would eat it.
It just relaxes you, right? It just calms you down. Why would you take it before an extreme sport or endeavor? I don't understand.
So initially, these drugs were banned because they are illegal in most countries. And so WADA called these drugs of abuse. And what they're saying is that athletes should be held at a higher moral and ethical standard than the rest of the world because they are role models for our children. So if they're going to take these drugs, then our kids are going to take these drugs. That is not a notion that I buy into. My daughter is 13 years old. There is no one in the world who's responsible for her behavior except for me and her mother, and that's it. And so I don't allow I'm not going to abdicate my responsibilities to my child to someone else's behavior. When I was a kid, of course, I had role models, and as much as I thought that these particular athletes were just incredible, but I never did anything that they did because they were doing it, especially if I thought it was dangerous. So I get rid of that notion right off the bat. Once we had this one ban, and if you were watching this most recent Olympics, you saw Sha'Carri Richardson from the United States. She's from Dallas. So 2021, the Olympic trials were delayed, so were the Olympic Games because of COVID. She won the 100-meter dash in the Olympic trials for the United States, and then 2 days later, she was suspended because she had consumed cannabis, marijuana. And this took place in Oregon, where marijuana is legal. So right off the bat, I was just beyond myself. I didn't even realize that cannabis was on the banned list. Now, her reason for why she took this is a very human and understandable reason. Any one of us could empathize with this and understand right off the bat why she did it. She was raised by her grandmother and her aunts. She did not have much, if any, of a relationship with her birth mother. And 2 days prior to her 100-meter dash final, a smarmy journalist confronted her with one of these gotcha questions. And he effectively asked her, I'm paraphrasing, how do you respond to knowing that your birth mother has died? Well, she didn't know. So she went into what I would call as a panic attack. And her choice of means to alleviate her anxiety was to consume some marijuana. Now, she knew that it was against the rules. She knew that she was going to get tested for it. And she knew that if she got caught, she was going to get disqualified. That's how desperate she was to alleviate her anxiety after finding out that her mom had died and 2 days before the biggest race of her entire life. So she failed as a human. Now, did she deserve to be banned from the Olympics? I say not. And so there was a furor about this. And so WADA came out with a different explanation as to why it's a banned substance. And they gave us this ridiculous idea that marijuana could potentially be a performance-enhancing drug under certain circumstances. And they quoted a lot of basketball players who say that they smoke weed before a game because it allows them to focus better. Fine. But is that any different than caffeine? Is it any different than any other supplement you would take for the purposes of a focus? It's utter nonsense. None of these drugs should be banned. If someone has a drug problem, they need to be helped with their drug problem, not banned from their profession. So that's an outright joke, and it's something that WADA needs to take care of and take care of immediately.
Yeah, I mean, weed just got legalized here in Germany.
I read that.
from what I see, like the whole world is just accepting as a whole. Like, there's nothing wrong. It's like, as you said, caffeine. What's the difference? I mean, there's a difference, of course, but
Sure.
you shouldn't be punished for smoking weed, especially when her mom died. So there was an interviewer who asked her. He knew her mom was dead. Passed away, and instead of just telling her like a normal human before the interview, he decided to do a catch-up moment.
And that's I can't imagine something more cruel than that. I mean, this is a young lady, a young woman. I'm not even sure if she was in her 20s yet at this particular moment in time. But it doesn't matter how old someone is or how old experienced they are. You just don't do that to another human being. But that's beside the point. Here's the other point that I would bring up. Yeah. If someone has diagnosed anxiety, some sort of anxiety disorder, what WADA will allow you to take are some of these anxiolytic drugs, which tend to be I can't remember the name of them, but I'll remember in a second. But we're talking like Xanax would be one. Okay, Valium would be another. These are really, really heavy drugs, and they are habit forming as can possibly be. And it's extremely difficult to get off of them. And I can tell you why, because I took them myself. In fact, I took Xanax for a number of years because off label, it helps with sleep. But I had these remarkable side effects that I didn't even realize were the Xanax until the federal government started to really lock down tight on who could be prescribed Xanax. And I couldn't find a doctor to renew my prescription. And so I had to go cold turkey, and it was a miserable coming off of those particular drugs. Xanax is a tough one to come off of. It was about a week and a half of not sleeping very well at all, if at all. And then finally I got back to some regular sleep. But all of the side effects that I had, which were mostly gastrointestinal, went away immediately. So their solution to anxiety is to give you a pharmaceutical which has known side effects and is habit forming and very difficult to remove yourself from. But they won't allow you to take something which is derived from a plant that grows naturally on all the continents across the entire world minus Antarctica. That is just out of my mind stupid as far as I'm concerned. I cannot imagine why that would be the case, except the answer to all your questions, my friend, is money. If you watch the Olympics in the United States, every other commercial was another pharmaceutical drug. Every other bloody commercial was another pharmaceutical drug. That's why they would much rather you take that than something that they don't get any money off of. Now, that may be a very jaded and cynical view, but prove me wrong, IOC. Why is it that half the commercials that you air on the American broadcast are all for pharmaceutical companies? Why is that?
Well, they're getting paid for sure.
Paid, absolutely.
Yeah. Isn't I don't know if this is one of those TikToks that you see and you don't never see it again. A guy said like the Olympics are a scam. I think scam is a strong word, but he said that the only ones profiting from it are the organizers. The athletes are not getting anything. They're maybe getting gold medals which they can take home if they're very good at it. Otherwise, no, nothing. The countries where the Olympics are hosted are more often than not left with those white elephants, right? Those big empty stadiums that are never used afterwards. So I would like to ask you, Dr. Hutchison, is the Olympics a big scam?
I'm not going to put myself in a position of being sued by the IOC and saying that it's a big scam. However, I'm not going to not say it either. Here's where I would go with this. Mm-hmm. If we look at the countries, so let's go straight to China. So China had 21 athletes, at least maybe it was 23, between those two numbers, who tested positive for a banned substance prior to the Tokyo Olympics, and there was no punishment, and they kept it absolutely quiet until very recently that came out. Now, all of those athletes were allowed to compete. Some of them were on the swim team this most previous Olympics in Paris. And you have to ask the question, why? Why did they get to compete, but Sha'Carri Richardson was banned? If there's one thing that the IOC loves is to put on a games in a totalitarian dictatorship country. Because in that case, they don't have to worry about the mayor of Paris insisting that the swimming takes place in the Seine. They don't have to worry about the food not being what the athletes want. They don't have to worry about cardboard beds and nonsense like that. All those things happen in a democracy. Now, I'm very much for democracy, but when it comes to organizing a massive event like the Olympics, what you want is one person telling everybody what's going to happen, when it's going to happen, and how it's going to happen, and they deliver like that. Okay, so China and Russia are two of the favorite countries for the IOC to host their Olympics because they do it on time and they do it perfectly, and they pay a huge amount of money to the IOC. Now, let's go back to your point of athletes don't get paid. This is an enormous part of my book. Athletes do not get paid for their performances at the Olympic Games. If they win a gold medal in the United States, or any other medal for that matter, they have to pay federal taxes on the value of that medal once they get home.
You're fucking shitting me.
I'm kidding. It's 100% true.
Oh my god.
It's real. Now, what is the Olympics? It is a television program that needs viewers. And what are we tuning in to view? We're tuning in to view the athletes. The athletes are the product on the field, and they get nothing. In most instances, those athletes have to work 2 or 3 jobs just to keep the food on the table and allow themselves to train for the next Olympic cycle. We saw this with the women's water polo team. They were desperate for funding, and one of my favorite rappers, Flavor Flav, sponsored the team. That's ridiculous. We shouldn't have to do that. The IOC should be paying the athletes to show up, paying the athletes to compete, and you should get bonuses when you win an event. But that's not what happens. All that money goes to a very small cabal of very, very wealthy, old, mostly white men in Europe. That is just criminal, in my opinion. And so I'm going to move on to a distinction I'm going to make between international athletics and domestic athletics within the United States. So in the United States, we have 4 big leagues. We have the NFL, National Football League. We have Major League Baseball, the National Basketball Association, and the National Hockey League. And in all 4 of those leagues, we have unions that the athletes are members of. And they negotiate with ownership about pay, about time off, and also about which drugs will be tested for and what the punishments will be thereafter. The punishments for failing a drug test in the domestic American sports leagues is significantly less punitive than on the international scene. Now, what does the international scene have? 0 athlete representation, nothing. So a big part of my book is suggesting that the athletes who compete on the international scene must unionize to negotiate with the IOC or their own sports governing bodies for better pay or any pay at all, for health benefits after their careers are done, and then also how punitive they're going to be when it comes to drug testing. Now, I was asked this question by another one of the podcasts I was on recently, and he asked me, Dr. Hutchison, what if the athletes in a particular sport say they want to keep all the drug testing the exact same? Fine. Now they have a voice. And if that is what they vote, then I will keep my mouth shut because that is what they elected to do. But I would hope that they would negotiate some better pay and some better healthcare benefits for the duration of their life after they've given so much for my viewing benefit. And I will get off my soapbox at that point.
I see. And in order to achieve that, the best way, in your opinion, would be to unionize.
Absolutely. Okay. Unions are the key to everything. There was decades worth of history where athletes had 0 say over what they could do with their own careers. There was no such thing as a free agent in any of American sports until around the 70s, when they finally were able to come up with the ability to move from one team to another and negotiate their own salaries. If you were drafted by a particular team, they owned you. You were, I'm not going to use the word slave, but an indentured servant, let's say that. And the only way that you could get out of it was by leaving the sport altogether. That changed over time. And we saw the benefits of that in terms of not just for the athletes, but for the game itself. It improved dramatically once that happened. The same thing is going to be true when we take care of athletes on the international scene. I can tell you on our end, since we don't have a ministry of sport like you do in most Western countries, or actually most countries around the world, there is no money for athletes to train. There's a small amount that the US OC gives to athletes to help them train along, but it's a paltry sum, and we need to do better by our athletes. It's just not fair. It's simply not fair.
Of course, I mean, they're the soul of the whole thing.
They're the product.
Yeah, they're the product. So since we're talking about the Olympics, before going live, we shortly mentioned this case where a transgender athlete won, and apparently there was a huge scandal around it. I didn't follow the whole story through very well. I would like to know if you did, and if you
I did.
could explain a little bit better for us.
So the two athletes that I'm aware of were both boxers, and they're not transgender. So let me just define this. If you have a transgender person, they're born with one gender. The terminology that we use is gender they were assigned, which I don't agree with because no one assigns anything. You're born with a penis and testicles, or you're born with a vagina, one or the other. But once that happens, and it's typically where we see this is most often is a trans woman. So that means born a male and decides that they're going to live as a female. I am not a proponent of allowing trans females to compete with women. It's not fair. I can go into that forever and ever. In this case, what we had is someone who was born intersex. Now, this is a rare condition in which they are not born with completed sex organs of either gender. It's something that happens within the uterus during development. Now, this particular person was born intersex. Now, what exactly they had and don't have, we just don't know, because there's all this infighting and arguing in terms of what tests they did or did not pass. If someone is born with XX, that is a woman, period. In most instances, an intersex woman is not quite big enough to be considered a male because of the musculature that they have, but they have more musculature than does a female. So they will almost always go down into the female category. I shouldn't say down, over into the female category. But in most instances, those people are XY. I think it was the IBF, the International Boxing Federation, was the one who was in charge of boxing for the Olympics until this big old thing came up. And then the IOC kicked them out, and they went with like the Paris Boxing Association, something really small. So the IBF said that this person failed their gender test. They were XY. There was a bunch of people who said that's not true. That's not what happened. And so the Paris Boxing Federation passed this person, said they passed their gender test. They're good to go. They can box. This is much different than what we're talking about with trans athletes. Trans athletes are born males, period. They are male. Once they go through male puberty, they have absolute physiological advantages over women, period. It doesn't matter how much estrogen you pump into them. It doesn't matter how many testosterone blockers you pump into them. Once puberty has happened, those things are going to be there, and they're going to be there for good. They're taller. They have more muscle mass. They have bigger hands, longer arms, longer legs, bigger feet, bigger hearts, bigger lung capacity. I could go on and on.
That's a fact.
Okay. That's a fact. Doesn't change. Now, that will decrease some. If you take away testosterone and you put in estrogen, muscle mass will decrease some, but it will not decrease all the way down to the point where they would be considered an equivalent female within their ranks. So if you had the fifth-ranked male cyclist in the world that decided that they wanted to become a woman, and they go through the entire process of transitioning to a woman. Once they transition over here, they're going to be number one. So let me change those numbers because that didn't make any sense. Let's say you had the 2000th ranked male, and then they transition. They're not going to become the 2000th ranked female. They're going to be in the top 10. That's just the way it is. Okay, and I can back this up with data from other people who we've seen within the United States. The most prominent one would be Leah Thomas, who started her life off as William Thomas and swam for the University of Pennsylvania men's swim team for 3 years, then went through a year off while she transitioned, and I'll call her she, I'll be respectful of that, to competing with the females. Leah was the 1,030th ranked 100 freestyle swimmer in NCAA for men. When she transitioned over to a woman, 13. That can't happen. That's absurd. And everybody who believes in science can look at that and know that that's just not fair. Now, if that process of that transition went from 1,030 to somewhere around 1,030, fine. But that's not what happens. So that part is something that's been pretty well agreed upon, at least on the international scene. That's not going to happen. What I think needs to happen there is that we need to have a non-binary division for these folks to go into and compete. They need to have a space in sports. I'm not interested in kicking out anybody from sports. I'm too much of a sports fan, and I know the benefits that it can have in your life beyond physiology. Emotionally, community-wise, you need to be able to participate, but you have to have your own division. So that's my diatribe on that. But this other person, this is much stickier because they're not born male or female. They're somewhere in between. And you're asking a whole lot of people to just say, you can no longer participate until you get a surgery to remove these undescended testicles, or we knock down your testosterone levels. It's really, really complicated. But what we need more than anything else is complete transparency. If these folks want to compete with women, they have to be transparent about what they're packing downstairs and what their genetic code is. They just have to be. And I know it's invasive, and I know it takes away their privacy, but so does everything related to doping. All of these doping tests that people have to take out of season, they show up at any hour of the day that they want, any place that they want. You have to tell them where you're going to be at all hours of every day, whether you're on vacation or going to the doctor's office or anything else. And if you don't do so, that's the same as testing positive for doping. So if we're going to hold our, I'm not going to use the word cis because I don't agree with it. Are we going to hold our male and female athletes to that standard of privacy violations? It shouldn't be any different for an intersex athlete who wants to prove that they belong.
Yeah, just create a new division for them. Why not?
I agree.
Yeah.
I completely agree.
Because one thing's for sure, I think we can all agree that we want to have fairness in sport. We all want to compete in a fair space, so we have chances of winning. That's for sure. So, and I mean,
as fair as we can make it. Let me put it that way. As fair as you can possibly make it. There is nothing inherently fair about sports. Nothing.
Oh.
There's nothing.
Okay.
And I put this in my book. The performance-enhancing drugs are not the biggest predictor of athletic performance. The biggest predictor of athletic performance is money. Money, money, money. If you come from a wealthy nation, your capacity to win a medal is significantly higher than if you come from a poorer nation. So if we correlate the GDP of the different nations with the number of medals that they win at the Olympics, it's really, really close. It approaches 1. Okay, so when we talk about fairness in sport, we make sports remarkably unfair all the time just by having more resources than the person next to us. And I'm not interested in changing that whatsoever. That's just the way the world works. That's the way humans work. And that's the way nature works. To the victor go the spoils. So we can do what's akin to effectively a welfare system to make it so that some athletes at least have a baseline level of competitiveness because we allow them to have that many resources. But once we get past that, the nation with the most money is going to have the highest trained athletes with the best coaches, the best facilities, and the best equipment, the best nutrition, the best recovery, the best sleep, period.
I mean, putting like that, it makes sense. It does make sense. Dr. Hutchison, I have one more question. What are PEDs?
Performance enhancing drug. We should have done that at the beginning. My mistake.
No problem. And you said that they should be used to speed up recovery and prevent injuries, right? So we advocate for that. And
yes.
Could you elaborate a little bit more on this?
Certainly. There are certain drugs that we know for sure allow us to recover from injuries and also just recover between workouts. That's really the crux of what we're trying to do with performance enhancing drugs, is to allow us to. So when we talk about recovery, what does that really mean? Let's say that you go out today and you do a 5-mile run. During that run, you're going to burn through a bunch of calories that you have stored in your liver and your muscles. You're going to do some damage to your muscles that will have to be repaired. You're going to do some damage to your bones that have to be repaired. The faster that repair can take place, the sooner you can do your next workout. The more intense your next workout can be, the more weight you can lift, etc. So the biggest thing that we see from these performance-enhancing drugs is that athletes are able to perform in their training at a much higher level than they could if they didn't take it. So when we say that a performance-enhancing drug is a shortcut to your objective, it could not be more wrong. Athletes who take performance-enhancing drugs, they work out harder, they work out longer, and they work out more frequently than athletes who don't take it. So it's the exact opposite of a shortcut. It's the long way home. Now, I'm not saying that makes it right or wrong. I'm just saying let's get the terminology right. Because one of the things that we like to say about athletes who take performance-enhancing drugs, you never would have achieved that goal had you not taken them. That's probably true. We don't really know how well they would have done, but they did not get to that point by sitting on the couch with 2 beers in each hand and then just hopping off to the Olympic Games. They worked their rear ends off for months and months and months, even more so than their competitors who did not take those drugs. We know that as a fact.
Beautiful. Dr. Hutchison, thank you so much. Where can we find you? Where can we find your book? Please let us know.
My website is goodegg.fitness. So it's GOODEGG.fitness. I've got all my books on there. I've got all the podcasts I've been on. Once you send me this one, I'm going to put it on my website as well. All of my books can be found on Amazon. I've got 3 currently out. The first one is called Exercise Ain't Enough. And that's all about how exercise is not the best method to use in terms of weight loss. Diet always trumps weight loss. The second one is called The Swim Prescription, and it's all about how swimming is better for you physiologically and psychologically, neurologically than any land-based exercise. And then the third one is my most recent book, which is called In Defense of Doping.
Beautiful. Okay, we're going to make sure to leave the links on the description below. Do you have any final remarks, anything else I'd like to say?
I just want to thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure, and I hope we get to talk again sometime in the future.
Yeah, me too. I mean, you just mentioned some other incredible, interesting books. I would love to talk with you again someday.
That sounds great.
All right. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure. Bye, everyone. If it's your first time watching the show, make sure to like and subscribe. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, please make sure to rank the show 5 stars. This will ensure that the podcast will be recommended to even more people and allow me to keep doing what I love. Check out now the BruCast store, Explorer store, filled with awesome goodies from hoodies to t-shirts to mugs. We've got you covered. Stay in style with BruCast. Embrace the shock, set the trend. Buy now at brew-cast.com/store. I repeat, brew-cast.com/store. Link on the description below. BruCast also on Instagram, X, and TikTok, where I upload shorts with the highlights of the show. So follow now, BruCast on Instagram, X, and TikTok. Links below. Thank you, everyone. See you next time. Bye, Dr. Red.